There are questions that haunt believers quietly. Questions rarely spoken out loud in church, but whispered in the dark when prayers feel unanswered. One of those questions is this: if my marriage is without intimacy, is God displeased with me? You sit beside the person you vowed your life to, yet feel oceans apart. The house is quiet. The bed is cold. The silence between you is heavier than any argument you've ever had. And in that silence, a fear grows. Is this my fault? Have I failed God? Is my marriage now living in sin because something essential is missing? Many believers carry deep shame around this struggle. They wonder if a sexless marriage is a spiritual failure, a hidden rebellion, or even a great sin in the eyes of God. They replay sermons, half-remembered verses, cultural expectations, and whispered opinions, trying to measure themselves against a standard they don't fully understand. But hear this carefully. God sees more than behaviors. He sees hearts, he sees wounds, he sees covenants strained by pain, trauma, illness, misunderstanding, exhaustion, unmet expectations, and years of unspoken hurt. The question is not simply about sex, it's about intimacy, unity, love, sacrifice, and truth. It's about whether God measures marriage by performance or by faithfulness. If you've been afraid that God is disappointed in you, if you've wondered whether your marriage has fallen outside His grace, if guilt has replaced peace every time this subject comes up, then stay with me, because what Scripture actually reveals may surprise you, and more importantly, it may heal you. To answer this question honestly, we must slow down and return to God's heart, not to pressure, tradition, or fear-based interpretations that burden the soul. Too many believers judge themselves by cultural expectations rather than by Scripture rightly understood. And when it comes to marriage, especially intimacy, misunderstanding God's intent can create unnecessary shame. Marriage, in God's design, is first a covenant before it is a contract. It is a spiritual union rooted in faithfulness, love, and mutual self-giving. Sexual intimacy is a precious gift within that covenant. But it is not the foundation of the covenant itself. The foundation is commitment, love, and the presence of God between two people who vowed before Him to walk together. The Bible does speak about intimacy in marriage, but it never speaks about it with cruelty or condemnation. Scripture acknowledges desire, but it also acknowledges seasons, times of closeness and times of distance. It speaks of mutual giving, never coercion. It calls for love that is patient, kind, and understanding, not demanding or shaming. A sexless marriage is not automatically a great sin in God's eyes. That is a critical truth many need to hear. Sin, in its biblical sense, is rooted in rebellion of the heart, hardness toward God, and willful harm toward others. Many marriages struggle with intimacy not because of rebellion, but because of wounds, unhealed trauma, emotional neglect, physical illness, mental health struggles, hormonal changes, grief, or years of unresolved conflict. God does not confuse brokenness with wickedness. At the same time, Scripture invites honest reflection, not to condemn, but to heal. God asks questions deeper than surface behavior. Is there love? Is there faithfulness? Is there humility? Is there a willingness to seek understanding and restoration? These questions reveal the heart far more than statistics or comparisons ever could. Many believers feel distant from God during these seasons, wondering why prayer feels quiet and answers feel delayed. This is why the devotional When God is Silent, linked in the pinned comment, has helped so many reconnect with God during emotionally dry and confusing seasons. Silence does not always mean God is displeased. Often it means He is drawing us into deeper trust and deeper honesty. Before calling something a great sin, we must learn to see it the way God does, through the lens of truth, grace, and redemptive love. Before we go any deeper, pause for a moment, not for the sake of a channel, but as a spiritual act of alignment. When truth confronts shame, the soul must choose which voice it will believe. If you are watching this and something inside you feels seen, acknowledged, or gently challenged, type "God sees my heart" in the comments. Not as a slogan, but as a declaration of faith, a reminder to yourself that God's eyes are not harsh, not impatient, and not blind to your pain. If this message resonates, like this video, as a quiet prayer, that truth will replace fear in your life and in your marriage. And if you know someone, husband or wife, who is silently wrestling with guilt, confusion, or spiritual anxiety around intimacy, share this with them. Sometimes God answers prayers by placing the right words in someone's path at the right time. There was a couple, let us call them Daniel and Ruth, who had been married for nearly 2 decades. They were faithful believers. They served in church. They prayed before meals. They raised their children with scripture. To anyone looking in from the outside, their marriage looked steady, respectable, and intact. But what no one saw was the quiet distance that had grown between them. It did not begin with rejection. It began with exhaustion. Long work hours that stole their energy, sleepless nights with young children, financial pressure that turned conversations into calculations, ministry commitments that consumed their best emotional hours and left only leftovers for each other. At first, intimacy simply became less frequent. Then it became awkward. Then it became avoided. And finally, it became unspoken. Ruth carried wounds she never learned how to name. Years earlier, words spoken carelessly by Daniel, never meant to harm, had lodged deep inside her heart. She began to feel invisible, needed but not desired, valued for what she did, not for who she was. Each time intimacy felt rushed or disconnected, something inside her recoiled. She told herself she was being strong. She told herself she was being spiritual. But inwardly she was withdrawing, protecting herself from disappointment she no longer had the strength to confront. Daniel, meanwhile, carried a different kind of pain. He felt rejected but could not articulate it without sounding selfish or unspiritual. He had been taught that strong men do not complain, that godly husbands suppress their needs and pray harder. So he did. He prayed, but his prayers slowly turned hollow. He began to wonder if something was wrong with him, or worse, if God was disciplining him. Instead of leaning toward Ruth, he pulled back. Instead of confessing his loneliness, he armored his heart. Years passed like this. Their marriage became functional but not intimate, faithful but not warm, organized but not alive. They worked well as partners, parents and servants of God, but not as lovers, not as one flesh. Silence settled into their home like a permanent guest. One evening, after attending a church service focused on marriage, Ruth lay awake staring at the ceiling, her chest tight. The preacher had spoken passionately about husbands and wives becoming one flesh, about desire, unity, and God's design. The words were meant to inspire, but to her they felt like accusation. Tears rolled silently down her face as she whispered into the darkness, "God, am I sinning against you?" Daniel lay beside her, awake as well, asking a different question in the same silence. "God, have you abandoned this part of my life?" Neither of them felt rebellious. Neither of them felt cruel or selfish, but both felt condemned, and condemnation, when left unchecked, hardens hearts and deepens distance. The turning point did not come through a dramatic event. It came through emotional collapse. One night, after a small disagreement that carried years of weight behind it, Ruth finally admitted what she had been afraid to say. "I feel numb." Daniel responded not with anger, but with exhaustion of his own. "I feel alone." And for the first time in years, truth entered the room. And with it came fear, because they believed truth would bring judgment. They expected blame. They expected God's displeasure to finally fall. Instead, something unexpected happened. As they sought counsel, prayed honestly instead of performatively, and opened wounds long buried, they began to see what had really happened. Their lack of intimacy was not the core issue. It was the symptom. The real problem was years of unspoken pain, unmet expectations, unresolved resentment, and spiritual silence disguised as strength. God was not angry with them. He was waiting for honesty. Healing was not immediate. It was slow. There were uncomfortable conversations. There were tears. There were setbacks. But in that process, something sacred emerged, a realization that changed everything. God had never measured their marriage by performance. He had been watching their hearts all along. And once they stopped hiding, restoration, true restoration, finally had room to begin. When Scripture speaks about marriage and intimacy, it does so with depth, balance, and spiritual wisdom, never with reductionism. The Bible does not flatten human complexity into rigid rules. Instead, it reveals God's heart toward both holiness and healing. The Apostle Paul addresses intimacy in marriage with clarity, but also with remarkable nuance. He speaks of mutual giving, mutual authority, and mutual consent. This is critical. Biblical intimacy is never presented as a demand enforced by guilt, nor as an entitlement claimed without regard for the other person's heart, body, or soul. It is framed as a shared expression of love within unity, not as a metric by which righteousness is measured. This is where many believers quietly suffer. They confuse instruction with indictment. They read passages meant to guide healthy connection, and instead hear accusations when their reality does not match the ideal. But Scripture was never given to crush the wounded. It was given to lead them toward life. To understand whether something is sin in God's eyes, we must understand how Scripture defines sin. Biblically, sin is rooted in willful rebellion, hardness of heart, and rejection of God's truth. It is not the same as struggle. It is not the same as limitation, and it is not the same as brokenness. There is a profound difference between a marriage that withholds intimacy out of contempt, manipulation, or power, and a marriage where intimacy has faded because of fear, trauma, emotional disconnection, illness, depression, grief, hormonal imbalance, or years of unresolved pain. God sees that difference clearly, even when people do not. Psychologically, this distinction matters deeply. Human intimacy is inseparable from emotional safety. When a person feels unseen, pressured, unsafe, or emotionally abandoned, the body often responds by shutting down desire. This is not defiance. It is self-preservation. The nervous system does not distinguish between physical threat and emotional threat in the way we often assume. When the heart feels unsafe, the body follows. God, who designed the mind, emotions, and nervous system, does not punish people for responding to pain the way He created them to respond. He does not shame trauma. He does not condemn the wounded for bleeding. This is why shame-based theology is so destructive in marriage. Shame does not awaken desire. Pressure does not restore intimacy. Fear does not create unity. In fact, they do the opposite. They deepen withdrawal and harden silence. Scripture consistently shows that God restores through love. Husbands are called to love their wives sacrificially, not demandingly. Wives are called to respect their husbands, not by suppressing their own pain, but by walking in truth and partnership. And both are called to humility, confession, patience, and mutual care. When intimacy is absent, God's primary question is not who is guilty, it is what is wounded. Sometimes the most spiritual thing a couple can do is stop pretending everything is fine and begin seeking help. Prayer is essential, but prayer is not meant to replace wisdom, counsel, honest conversation, or healing work. God often answers prayers through process, not instant change. Conviction draws us toward the light. Condemnation drives us into hiding. If guilt has made you pull away from God rather than lean into Him, that guilt did not come from His Spirit. God's desire is not to shame struggling marriages into compliance. It is to restore broken hearts into wholeness. And restoration always begins with truth spoken in love. If you are listening to this right now and something inside you feels exposed, not in fear, but in recognition, hear this clearly and let it settle deep in your spirit. God is not disappointed in you. He is not standing at a distance, arms crossed, measuring your marriage against an idealized version you cannot reach. He is standing close, attentive, compassionate, and fully aware of the complexity of your story. He sees the effort you've made. He sees the restraint you've shown. He sees the prayers you've whispered when words felt dangerous. And he sees the tears you cried where no one else could. You are not failing God because you are struggling. You are not sinful because you are wounded. You are not disqualified because intimacy has been difficult. This season is not evidence of God's absence. It is often the place where He works most gently and most deeply. The enemy uses shame to isolate. God uses truth to restore. And the truth is this: dryness does not mean death. Silence does not mean abandonment. Delay does not mean denial. What feels empty right now may be the very place God is preparing for healing if you will let Him in without fear. There is no condemnation coming from heaven toward you. There is invitation. An invitation to stop carrying this alone. An invitation to speak honestly, with God and, when possible, with one another. An invitation to seek healing without shame. God restores what people label too broken. He redeems what feels beyond repair, and He does it not by force, but by love, steady, patient, and faithful. If you have believed the lie that God is angry with you over this, release it now. That voice is not His. His voice calls you closer, not farther away. His correction is gentle. His conviction brings clarity, not despair. You are still chosen. Your marriage is still seen. Your future is not cancelled. God is not finished with you or with the story He is writing through your life. And what He restors with purpose. If you are still here with me, thank you. Staying to the end of a message like this is not passive. It is an act of courage. It tells me that you are not running from the truth and you are not hiding from God. You are seeking understanding, healing, and peace. If this message spoke into your life, I invite you to make a simple but meaningful declaration in the comments. Type "healing over shame." Let it be your reminder that God's truth is greater than fear-driven guilt and that restoration begins where honesty is allowed to breathe. If this word resonated, like this video, not for numbers, but as a sign of agreement with what you've heard today, share it with someone you love, someone who may be silently struggling in their marriage, or someone who needs reassurance that God has not withdrawn His grace from them. If you haven't already, consider subscribing so you can continue walking with us. Where faith is not shallow, where Scripture meets real life, and where God's heart is revealed with truth and compassion. You can also use the hype feature to help this message reach others who need it. If you feel led and are able, you can support this ministry by becoming a member or giving through Super Thanks. Your support helps ensure that these messages continue reaching those who feel unseen, unheard, or burdened by unnecessary shame. And remember, for those seasons when God feels quiet and answers feel delayed, the devotional "When God is Silent," linked in the pinned comment, was created to help you reconnect with Him in the silence, not run from it. No matter where you are in your marriage today, whether intimacy feels distant, confusing, or painfully absent, God has not stepped away from you. His grace still covers you, His wisdom still leads you, and His love still restores. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Keep walking with God.